Hey everyone, in today's episode we're going to be talking about the long road of various Hyper-V management tools. So Hyper-V's been out for a while now and there are a number of different tools available. We've got Hyper-V Manager, Failover Cluster Manager, PowerShell, we've got System Center, Virtual Machine Manager. The list goes on and on. And in fact, when Eric, our guest speaker, sat down to talk about this episode, we found that, hey, there's a lot more content here than what can be contained within a single episode. So what we've done is we've broken up this episode into a two-parter. So the first part of the episode, we're going to be talking about, what I would consider to be the traditional management tools. Hyper-V Manager, Failover Cluster Manager, PowerShell, where they're at, where they're still useful today. And then in next week's episode, part 2 of this series, we're going to be talking about Windows Admin Center. We're going to be talking about Azure Arc and how that's changing the future of Hyper-V management. Coming up next on the SysAdmin DOJO podcast. Well, hey everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the DOJO podcast, the podcast that's designed to help you become the IT black belt within your organization. I'm your host, Andy Sirwich, and, as we've seen on several episodes already, I've got a good friend of mine on the line again, Eric Siron. How's it going, my friend?
I'm all right. How you doing, bud?
Hey, doing good. It's funny, you and I were just joking just before we hit the record button here, Our goal with this podcast is to go for 30, 40-ish minutes, but as we've seen in previous episodes, we don't always really strictly adhere to that, right? Sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's 25. No, who am I kidding? I don't think we've ever gone as short as 25. But, like we said, let's just shoot for 30 minutes of content here, give or take 90, right?
There you go.
Give or take 90.
I think I can do those parameters.
Right. Anyway, so, kind of what gave me the idea of today's topic is, we did a session a little while back, episode. We did an episode a little while back on the state of the VMware versus Hyper-V discussion 2021 edition, right? Now, in that particular conversation, you, myself, we had Xavier on the line for that one, representing the VMware side of the debate, right? But what kept coming up time and time again is how, it's kind of generally accepted, and this is kind of the same opinion, this is the opinion I have as well, is that the management story on the Hyper-V side of the house is not... The management story is just not as good on the Hyper-V side of the house as it is on the VMware side of the house, right? I think you share that opinion if I remember correctly. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, you're right. That's correct. So,
you look at things on the VMware side and you've got a very clear-cut story. You've got vCenter and you've got, the vSphere Manager. I forget exactly what the tool is called. It's been that long since I've really dug into VMware all that much. But on the Hyper-V side, we have how many tools now? I think 6, maybe 7. I've kind of lost track now. So I think what we should do, let's start with what are the historical classic Hyper-V management utilities, if you were. And by my count, we've got Hyper-V Manager, we've got Failover Cluster Manager, we've got, dare I say it, System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And, if you guys, anybody listening to the show has heard a previous episode, you probably know my stance on that particular tool. We'll get into more of that. And then finally, we've got PowerShell, right? I think that's what I at least would consider to be the quote-unquote classic Hyper-V management tools. Did I miss any there?
That's the ones I know of.
Yeah, so, I think if I put my hat on as a Hyper-V administrator, I probably spend 80% of my time in, well, maybe that's a lie. Maybe more like 70% of my time in Failover Cluster Manager, 20% of my time in Hyper-V Manager, and 10% of my time in PowerShell. That's, I guess, how I would break it down. What do you think your breakdown would be, Eric?
I'd have to think about that a while, but I think where I'm at now is, you know how IT we have feast and famine cycles, right? And so if I don't have anything coming, I'm in a famine, then it's probably PowerShell and probably not very often. I'm probably not really doing anything with it. It just kind of
Right.
runs. And then what I use during feast periods will depend on the problem set before me. And a lot of times if it's bulk work, I'm going to do PowerShell. I'm still going to do PowerShell.
Right.
I usually won't use the graphical tools unless I've got some like a series of one-offs that don't really have a lot in common with each other, and it just makes more sense.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if I look at my day-to-day, if I'm just doing day-to-day maintenance, yeah, that breakdown that I listed out probably stands. But, I look back to when I was standing that cluster up and getting things ready. I think I spent more time in PowerShell than anything else, just because, from a configuration perspective, I'm faster that way,
Right. If you built enough clusters, PowerShell is, you really get aggravated with the GUI. It just doesn't move quickly enough. I know what the answers are. Stop asking. Right. So, yeah. But people new to the game are still going to be using Failover Cluster Manager. People who don't do it very often, and they're probably like, go fast.
Right.
Or feel differently than you.
Or the other side of the coin I found is that people are confused by the fact that Failover Cluster Manager is a tool for managing Hyper-V. Right? Because, Hyper-V is not the only workload that you can manage using FCM. I find that, and I've shared this feedback with Microsoft before, and they've acknowledged, yes, we're improving. The answer is we're always improving our management tools, which, is true of any company. But I've shared this.
I guess.
Yeah, right. Well, I've shared this feedback before in that most people in virtualization have gotten their start on the VMware side. Now, I say most. Right. That's myself included. What happens is when somebody comes over into the Hyper-V world from VMware, they see, Hyper-V Manager, and they instantly make the association that Hyper-V Manager is the all-inclusive, all-in-one management tool for Hyper-V, like you have on the VMware side. And then they're like, wait, I can't do my clustering from here? What are you talking about? Or, right. And it throws people off.
And I think the biggest problem there, too, is if you have always been in the Microsoft stack, nothing about that is weird. Because if you build a SQL cluster and then try to turn around and build a VM cluster, you're like, okay, that was pretty much the same.
Yep, it makes sense.
You know what I mean? So it really depends on where you started from, and it's why I've always been telling people, like, if you're walking into Hyper-V from VMware and you're expecting the same, you're going to be really disappointed and lost. Don't do that. You got to think of what would Microsoft do? WWMD, and whenever you answer that question, you're probably going to be fine.
What would Microsoft do? There we go. I haven't heard that one yet. I'm gonna I'm gonna have to put that one in the holster for future use.
Got from one of my Microsoft trainers, and then I used it when I was a Microsoft trainer. Like, that's how you got to think. You want to pass those exams? What would Microsoft do? That's answer B.
That's funny. I'm putting that one in the holster. So, this reminds me of an instance I ran into once. Now, I spend most of my time doing content and lab work and community stuff now, right? But I still moonlight as a contractor on occasion just to keep my saw sharp, right? And I remember this would have been I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what should have been a Windows Server 2016 cluster. Now, same situation, the guy came over from VMware, and the reason he reached out to me, word of mouth here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's kind of how he ended up getting a hold of me. But he calls me up and he says, hey, I just set up Hyper-V for the first time. I have a 2-node cluster, and my domain controllers, the disks are my file systems are corrupting. What's going on? Hyper-V just isn't stable.
Oh no! I know where you're going. Go ahead, finish your story.
And I'm just like, you didn't set up CSV, did you? Huh? What? You didn't set up CSV, did you? He's like, What's CSV?
That's the way I did it in VMware, and it should have just worked, right?
Right, it should have just worked. Come to find out, he didn't set up CSV. He had each host pointing to the same storage, which is where the VM files live. And, for those that aren't familiar with Microsoft clustering, Windows Server clustering, if you don't have cluster shared volume set up, there's nothing to act as the traffic cop when it comes to storage reads and writes. So basically what we had is we had two Hyper-V hosts that were steamrolling the virtual machine storage, depending on which host had the VM at the time. So NTFS inside of his domain controller VMs just kept blowing up because there was no cluster shared volume. Now, again,
he must have done some serious work to even get that far, because Windows really doesn't like looking at another Windows box opens like, that's corrupt. What are you doing here? What are you doing?
Exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
He must have done some hardcore shoehorning to even get that far.
Well, he probably just kept troubleshooting it. Now, that said, he should have stopped at some point to say, hey, I'm a VMware administrator. I need to admit, he should have admitted to himself that, okay, I probably don't know Hyper-V, and he should have went out and read docs.microsoft.com, right? But anybody who's worked in the trenches know, hey, there's deadlines, stuff needs to get done, and, we're just going to, hit next on the setup, and we're going to see what happens, right?
Well, if you've been in business long enough, you're not used to having resources. You just have to fumble your way through and take it till you make it,
Yep, exactly.
I can't blame him for landing there. I get how that happens.
Yep, and thankfully, he still had a good DC, the one with the FSMO roles, still living on his vSphere cluster, so everything was fine, no damage was done. But that's the situation I always think of when it comes to new people starting out with Hyper-V management. You don't know what you don't know, and it's easy to shoot yourself in the foot, especially from a cluster creation point of view. Now, I think the other area that I see people get hung up on is just, figuring out, how do I carve up my storage? How do I divide up my network adapters? But I think I saw you answer a question on the forums today about network adapters, didn't you, on the DOJO forums? Or it was recently. I don't remember when I saw it, but that seems to be
it was today, but
all the days blend together after a while, don't they? But that comes back to the management story there too, because again, I hate to keep comparing it with VMware, but in VMware, there's just a virtual networking section, and that's where I see my adapters. That's where I configure them. That's how I configure my switches. And on the Microsoft side, I have all kinds of different ways of doing it. Maybe if I want to do switch embedded teaming, I'm going to go and do it inside of PowerShell, or maybe I have a third-party vendor, like I know some HP NICs have their own teaming mechanisms, right? So you set up an HP NIC team, and then you present the virtual NIC to be used inside of the Hyper-V switch, or you use Windows, the NIC teaming that's baked into Windows Server. You can do that, an LBFO team, right? Which, don't quote me on that. I seem to recall that not being the preferred method anymore in Server 2021 or 2019.
No, one of the big program managers for high performance Windows has been carrying a flag of stop using LBFO. It's like his call sign every time he shows up. It's stop using LBFO.
Right. So, and what's funny is on 2021, the PowerShell commandlets for LBFO are still there. They're still there.
Well, they can't go away because none of the new tools are going to work except with a Hyper-V cluster.
Right. Yep.
Right? You can't use a switch embedded team for a SQL box. So if you're going to team on a physical unit and you're not going to use Hyper-V, you have to have LBFO.
Right. And this,
unless there's something I'm missing, but I don't think I am. I think that is how that's working.
No, right? I think you're spot on there. And I mean that comes back to Microsoft's their biggest advantage, but also their greatest weakness, and that is ecosystem support, right? they're going to make sure that they support any and all potential official business use case, right?
Yes. Well, there's also, let's say the other side of it is if you're big enough and you have the dollars, you don't configure your own stuff. You give Microsoft a stack of cash and they'll send out some PFEs to hang out in your building until it works right.
Right.
So the PFEs have to know what they're doing and then do enough to hand it off to local IT, and that's it. And so whenever you hear a lot of the program managers at Microsoft, well, all my customers that I talk to, that's the list of people they're going through. They're not talking to, the people who are listening to this podcast.
Right.
So
yes.
There's just a disconnect between, I feel, their typical customer and that they see and the typical customer that they actually have.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. I would totally agree with that. Going back to the networking, I think the other kind of hiccup I see is, people get confused as to, okay, I'm going to go over here and use iSCSI for my networking traffic. Do I team? They feel like they have to use Windows Server NIC teaming to team the storage adapters when, no, you need to go use MPIO instead, right?
Right.
And that throws people off too.
But then you throw a switch team in the mix, like, well, I'm teaming all these adapters, and you said not to. What do I do here? And like, well, then you get back to your it depends answer, which is always so much fun. And so we're like, and so I do get a lot of criticism. People like, you said not to mix MPIO and teaming, and then here you are giving me directions on how to mix MPIO and teaming. It's like, it's a little more nunuanced than that.
Right.
It's not really what I'm trying to help you to have the best of all worlds, which is, maybe I shouldn't do that. Like, no, do it this way and believe that it's the one true way and stop doing it, Because it is. It's big and confusing. And then once you get it straight in your head, you have it straight. It's not a big deal. But
right, exactly.
Walking into it cold, they're just too much to absorb in a single sitting or 5 sittings. And especially if you've already got VMware habits, and they approach virtualization from a whole different angle than Microsoft
they really
does.
do.
And it's just everything is different.
Yep. And that really throws people off. Because, really on the VMware side, for just about anything, you have like one, maybe 2 ways of doing things. Really, right. That's, they make those decisions for you. And again, I'm going to come back to, Microsoft's greatest strength, but their greatest weakness, depending on the administrator in question, is choice, right? So I feel like I've been negative of them so far in this particular episode, and I'm just pointing out the way I see things. But that said, Hyper-V is really good in a lot of ways too, right? And the management is really good in a lot of ways. And again, I'm going to come back to that choice, right? I can manage Hyper-V from basically any box I'm on, heck, the Mac that I'm recording this on right now, guess what I have? I've got PowerShell on this Mac. I just remote into my cluster and do whatever I want, I don't even have to log into the cluster. Or, I could RDP into one of the hosts. Or, I have a management server in my environment. Log into the management server, and there I've got Windows Admin Center, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Or if things get really dicey, I have all the traditional MMC tools and associated snap-ins, right? Hyper-V Manager, Failover Cluster Manager, ADUC, ADAC, DNS, DHCP, so yeah. So, that's one of the greatest strengths, right? Is, unified management across the entire Microsoft stack, right? So, I think that's always been a really powerful, thing. And, I mentioned PowerShell, just the power of... It's funny saying this, but the power of PowerShell. Not the first time I've said
that a few times, probably, but
right. Well, I had already committed myself there, so I couldn't not say it. But you think about just the power of PowerShell. I think what's funny is even VMware saw that Microsoft was onto something there, because now you look at PowerCLI, which is basically a VMware PowerShell module is all it is. You can do a lot of the same stuff with PowerCLI as you can do with PowerShell and Hyper-V, So I think they realized that, hey, somebody's onto something with with these PowerShell modules. We should do the same thing. So I will say, this would have been 3 years ago. I set out to create a data center deployment script, if you will. And I got this idea by watching, one of our favorite speakers, Ben Armstrong, give a session one time where I forget exactly what he called it. It was something along the lines of hold my beer while I deploy a data center or something along those lines. Sounds like something Ben would do. But, he basically, his was like way more involved than mine was. I mean, he deployed like 8 or 9 VMs and he's up there talking. And I remember at one point his script was executing and he's like, oh crap, I forgot to set a variable. And he's like, quick, I have to set this variable before the script gets to that particular point. And he's like editing the script and setting variables live while the script is running and praying that he gets the variable changed before it gets to that part. He was successful. Ben is always yes, right? He's
Nobody
always
else pulled that off.
I know, right? If it was me,
that guy can change the tire on his car while he's driving. Yeah,
that's the equivalent of what happened. Yes,
I know.
If it was me, it would have exploded into a ball of fire. Anyway,
the manufacturer. How did you do that?
Right. Well, bringing it back to my whole point about PowerShell here is I set out to do kind of the same thing, but more of like a PowerShell 101, 201 type of way. I wrote the script without functions, so it was very sequential because I find that administrators who are learning PowerShell for the first time, they can really follow step 1, step 2, step 3, do this, then this, then this, then this, right? So basically what the script did was used PowerShell remoting, and it used PowerShell Direct, which for those that aren't aware, PowerShell Direct is a PowerShell feature that allows you to run PowerShell commandlets directly against a virtual machine through the virtual machine bus. So you can basically remotely run PowerShell commands without having to traverse a network in order to do it, which is awesome. Boy, we could do a whole podcast just on PowerShell Direct, but anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm taking
rarely use it.
Oh, I love it. I use it all the time. Anyway, taking a side note for that. Anyway, so basically what the script would do is using PowerShell Direct, PowerShell remoting, it would deploy 2 virtual machines, 1 a domain controller, provision it as a new domain, provision a second VM, install the file server role, create a file share, join it to the domain. Did it all in an automated fashion. Now, again, I'm getting to a point here. I feel like I'm taking a long time to get there. Coming from the PowerShell management side of this. So I did this script in Hyper-V, and then I did the same thing using PowerCLI with VMware. And the Hyper-V version, if I recall correctly, is like 60 lines less. It's way more efficient than the VMware version, mainly because
I have not been impressed. Like, as strongly as I feel about VMware beating Microsoft on the graphical side, I'm going to go the other way on the CLI.
Correct. That's exactly where I was going. Yep.
Well, there you go. So yeah,
totally.
Stole your moment.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I'm glad you arrived at the same place because that's where I was going with it. Was it's so much more efficient on the Hyper-V side, and I think because, if I remember correctly, the big hang-up was VMware Tools. VMware Tools, waiting for VMware Tools, which is that virtual driver and utility stack that gets installed inside of the VM, waiting for that to come up and be like, hey, I'm alive and working. That was the big hang-up on the PowerCLI side. But I digress. It's funny. We've been talking about the classical tools for a while now. You know which one we haven't mentioned?
Obviously I don't, or I would have said it.
I listed 4 off when we started the segment. We've talked about 3 of them. System Center Virtual Machine Manager.
We talked about that one.
Did we? We mentioned it.
Yeah.
So
I don't use it unless I have to. I guess I'm not quite. If on my worst day, I will tell you that using VMM in production is an anti-pattern. That is me
Yeah.
on my worst day, and at that moment in time, I fully believe it. Now it's really not that bad, but it can be,
Right.
obviously, because I get there with it. But it is my last choice in tools. It really is.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't remember the last time I used VMM. Now, that said, I think the largest Hyper-V cluster that I've managed in the last 5 years has been 10, maybe 12 nodes. So
Sure. And
nothing huge, you know?
it is better when you have multiple clusters
Yep.
and you are not using them as general purpose clusters.
Right.
So if you have one like big data center and all you're doing is I make clusters bigger until I hit the magic 64 number and then I go to the next cluster. If that's what you're doing, then VMM probably doesn't add a whole lot because you're just a commodity at that point.
Right.
If you're like, oh, this one runs my cool client stuff, and this one runs my okay client stuff, and this runs my database or whatever. And if you're doing that, then all of a sudden, then you get into all the concepts they have of like their services and whatnot, and there are some things there that are they're worthwhile, I guess, if that's really the level of scope that you're doing. But I still don't use it.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I can see the enterprises, the large enterprises of the world using this, right? And I think one thing that I always felt was kind of cool about VMM was the ability to carve up clouds, right? Basically, set aside a collection of resources and delegate access to maybe a department IT head for those resources. Oh, you're the IT head of accounting. Here you go. Here's 48 gigs of memory. Here's, 12 virtual CPUs. Do what you want with it, right? So I always felt like VMM did a really good job of that. I'm trying to think of the other things that VMM does well. Network virtualization. That was always another... Yeah. That originally was another strong suit, but I feel like the core Hyper-V product set itself has caught up in that regard.
Yes.
Because there was a time
when they
period...
first came out, you couldn't do it without VMM.
Exactly.
There was no way to manage it.
Yep.
And now you can. So at least there was no published way. I still wonder if there's not like a bunch of WMI stuff down, because that's where I spend most of my time, is down the WMI layer.
Yeah.
And you'll find things there that you can't hit any other way. Right. Now, they're probably like that because only weirdos like me are out there even, what's that do? But probably not a whole lot of use in production for them, but they're there, and I have a feeling that, I feel that HNV was probably like that in the very beginning. And then people are like, oh, no, we're really going to use this. And so, okay, so let's run it up into the standard management tools then. So.
Right. I think it also makes sense to look at SCVMM if you're using and licensing any of the other System Center suite products, right? There's...
You've already paid for it.
Yeah, so might as well use it, right?
You still need a database. You still need some place to put the files, the librarian. You still have a lot. It's heavy. It's heavy.
Yeah.
It's heavier. As I remember, it's heavier than vSphere, the management plane and vSphere.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So,
it's funny talking about where VMM fits. There's a situation where I was in at one point in my career where I can tell you exactly where VMM does not fit. So, and this is a very similar thing where we say, hey, coming from the VMware world, being used to a certain configuration methodology. This happened more on, I guess I would say, like a pre-sales type of situation. So, if you know me, I spent a lot of time working for a managed services provider, right? And I was the Hyper-V guy under the roof. I was, anytime there was a Hyper-V project, call Andy. Well, we had somebody on our sales team sell a Hyper-V solution one time. So, I start looking at the bill of materials and looking at the project outline and looking at what we're doing here. And all the licenses had already been sold. And I don't remember what licensing mechanism, or I shouldn't say mechanism, but I don't remember where they got the licenses. But once these particular licenses were purchased, they were purchased. and there was no returning them. So I don't remember exactly what the circumstances there were. So there was no easy go back button, is what I'm saying.
Right.
So I'm looking at the bill of materials here, and we're looking at, a set of fiber channel switches. We're looking at an EqualLogic SAN and 2 Hyper-V hosts and System Center Virtual Machine Manager for a 2-node cluster. For those,
Not me.
For those of you listening and not seeing, Eric was rolling his eyes just now, and I totally agree with that sentiment. Do not buy SCVMM for a 2-node installation. And this brings up a common question that I've gotten. You've probably gotten, Eric, too, is like, okay, at what number of hosts should I have before I even look at VMM? And again, you've mentioned it a couple of times. The answer depends on what you're trying to do. But if I had to set a number and put a big, large asterisk next to it that says it depends, I think the number I've always given folks, it's climbed over the years, but like I'm at the point to where I'm like, hey, in a perfect world, if you have no special requirements and you're wondering when to implement VMM, I would say 20 plus hosts. Blanket statement,
Interesting. You're braver than I am. I would refuse to answer the question. I say, you go out, download the demo. If you can get it installed, that's a good sign. Because I still don't feel like they've quite figured out how. It's almost like there's no one else they can go ask, hey, how do we make a good installer? Because VMM is really overly difficult to install. So if you can get it installed, that's a sign that maybe you're in the right place. And after that, you have to go through the different feature sets of it and look at what it has that you can't get in the other tools. And if you don't know the other tools well enough to make an apples to apples comparison, I think you're jumping into it too fast.
Right.
Because like we keep going on and on about how hard it is to understand virtual networking and Hyper-V. Well, I really mentally struggled with it in VMware for a while too.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's just because, I came in at version 3.5, I think, maybe, or 3 something. And maybe it just because of where I started and I was so far behind at that point that it was a little bit harder for me. But, you couldn't pick it all up in one sitting. It took time. Right.
Yep.
And it's the same deal with the Microsoft tools. And if you go straight into VMM, it assumes that you know things that you're not going to learn by using VMM.
It's very true.
So I tell people, get it in, get it installed, get it going, answer it for yourself. What can it do that the other ones can't? And do I need those? And am I willing to pay that sticker price for them? Yep. And if the answer is yes, then it's worth it to you and do it. And maybe that is a 2-node cluster. Maybe you say this is worth it to me. And that's fine. I never argue with somebody who says, you know what? I ran it through the ringer and I feel like this money's well spent. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I would agree with that. I think in this particular case, I may be a hair bit quick to judge because, being the engineer and not being consulted in any way, shape, or form by sales before they sell it, I'm just like, what the hell are you doing?
No, you're absolutely right. Because the salespeople are out there going, man, there's a lot of margin on that product.
Right. Even if it's like only 15%, which I think on most Microsoft licensing sales, it's roughly 15%. VMM is a chunk of cash to get.
And Hyper-V is 0.
Right.
And I don't know what the margin is on vSphere, but it's not 0.
Right.
Right. So your sales guy is like, I can sell VMM or I can sell vSphere, but I can't sell Hyper-V. So I would tend to agree with you that just walking in cold, 2-node cluster VMM, like that's somebody who wanted their money.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And a client who just, they
did know better.
Yeah. I feel really bad because and a lot of times we're not the only industry who takes advantage of the ignorance of clients, but I guess as an engineer who would rather get a lot of referrals after other people say he's an honest guy that won't steal from you, and then me turning away business like I can't help you anymore. I don't have capacity to help you. That's where I want to be rather than I only have 6 or 8 clients and they all hate me, but man, I'm rich. I mean. If you have to pick, I don't want to be the latter.
Right. Same.
But, and then again, I'm also say that what do the salespeople really know? Even because I can be really cynical and say it's all about the money for them, but what do they really know? And like you were saying at the place you're at, it's just you as the Hyper-V guy.
Right.
So if they don't have a Hyper-V guy on hand, it's the sales guy, and he's just looking at the product list for Microsoft. Well, Microsoft wants you to buy System Center too.
Right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for checking out today's episode. Again, in this part one of a two-part series, we covered what I call are the traditional Hyper-V management tools. Again, Hyper-V Manager, Failover Cluster Manager, PowerShell, System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Next week, in part two of this series, we're going to be talking about the next-gen Hyper-V management tools in Windows Admin Center, Azure Arc, and lots more coming up on next week's episode. And in the meantime, be sure to check out our other educational content out on the Dojo. That's www.altero.com/dojo. We got a number of different sections from you to choose from there, including, content about Hyper-V, VMware, MSP, backup and DR, M365, lots for you to choose from. In the meantime, again, thanks for tuning in this week, and we hope to see you again next week for another episode of the SysAdmin Dojo podcast. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.